Lost in 3 pines. The story is not very scary. Such cases are told quite often. But this story was told by my grandfather. So for me this story sounds real. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side lived in Latvia on a farm, 7 kilometers from the regional settlement of Izotka. This settlement arose in time immemorial, when old believers were exiled here or they themselves fled from persecution by the authorities. And the area there was remote, like parties in Belarus, swamps, black forests, gullies, windfalls, wild boars and wolves. Well now, of course, it is not the same. What was the farm? A large, wooden manor house and numerous outbuildings, sheds, storerooms, cellars, barns, a barn, a pigsty, a poultry house, vegetable gardens, fields, and all this is surrounded by forests. The fields were huge, no mechanization, hard labor. My grandfather and grandmother worked together. The hardest work was done by the brothers, who lived in the same farms beyond the fields, beyond the forests, several kilometers away. The children, my mother and aunt, also had their own responsibilities, very difficult for their age: cooking, washing, cleaning, collecting brushwood, mowing hay, grazing small livestock, sheep, geese, and a million other things. They had to walk 7 kilometers to school, in winter, in waist-deep snow through a dark forest. In general, life was not easy, even very. Mum told me that in winter, in the dead of night, wolves would come, stand on the porch, and look into the windows. The cattle would go crazy with fear. Then the Soviet power came, and my grandfather shrewdly and voluntarily gave all the land and animals to the collective farm and joined it himself. That's how he avoided dispossession. Then, the war, my grandfather went to the front in the first ranks because he was a communist. And my grandmother had to pull the whole farm and the children herself. The fascists showed up, and the forests were inhabited by Asics, forest brothers, like our banderites, that is, partisans. Grandma was hung twice. They scared her into revealing where the partisans were hiding. The partisans and fascists sometimes raided the farm and took away food: bread, leg of lamb, eggs, whatever they could find, but Grandma never protested or contradicted either of them, and so she survived. Auntie was sick with typhus. Her hair was cut, and after that it grew curly. They wanted to take Auntie to Germany, but Grandma bribed the village elder, and Auntie's age was reduced in her birth certificate. Having lived through all this, Grandma never complained, but told everything with some optimism, even with laughter, like an interesting fairy tale. She kept a smile until the end of her life. She was an amazing person. May she rest in peace and eternal memory. Grandfather returned from the war as an invalid, tuberculosis. Thanks to his grandmother's care and periodic hospital treatment, he lived long enough to see his grandchildren. But he was no longer capable of hard work. And in the end, tuberculosis finished him off. Getting off topic, I want to tell you about a small mystical incident that also happened to my grandfather. My grandfather had a favorite cat, Kotya. When he lay exhausted on the stove, the cat usually lay on his chest. When he was taken to the hospital in Daugavpils for the last time, the cat started crying at night. Grandma crossed herself, also started crying and said, "My Izotka is gone. He died." My grandfather's name was Izot Petrovich. And so it turned out. After that, the cat howled all the time, and then left the house. So don't tell me that dogs are loyal. My grandfather grew up and spent his whole life in these parts. He knew every forest down to the last path, every swamp down to the last hummock. But just imagine, he got lost in 3 pines. He never admitted that he got lost, but stubbornly insisted that the wood goblin was playing a joke on him. An old man walks through the forest, and walks, and the boletus mushrooms are one more beautiful than the other. The old man's nose is buried in the ground. He straightens up, his back aches. And look, holy mothers, where am I? All unfamiliar places. He goes along a clearing thinking, I'll come out on the highway like this. But the clearing suddenly became overgrown. He goes in the other direction. The road ends in a swamp. The old man spat in his heart and stomped straight through the forest. He walks and the forest gets darker and darker, the trees get thicker and thicker, and moss hangs from them. Black firs, 2 spans wide, their lower branches form a tent, and in that tent someone is fiddling and snorting. The old man got scared. He probably thinks it's a wild boar, a terrible animal, strong, aggressive and very fast. The old man, no longer thinking about the road, trotted out of there as quickly and quietly as possible. He ran a little, caught his breath, sat down on a fallen tree. He thought about it, couldn't understand how this could have happened. He got lost in his native forest, which he had walked and walked through. Wherever he turned, there were impassable thickets, windfalls and spruces, thick as baobabs. Under the shade of the trees, the sun was almost invisible. Only a weak yellow spot shone through. He started because he had fallen off a log in his sleep. How long have I been sleeping? He thought. He figured, no more than an hour. The sun had set slightly. The grandfather looked around, chose a direction to move in. He went. He walked, but there was no light in sight. It got dark, and the sun had risen higher. The grandfather got scared, looked, and it was the moon. Apparently, he had slept longer than he thought. Finally, the forest seemed to thin out, and lights began to loom ahead. The grandfather was as happy as a child and ran towards these lights. He realized, I went to Potapov's farm, or to Griever. I went too far. I'll spend the night at my brother Potap's. I don't have the strength to get home. And Potap always has some homebrew ready. These are the plans he makes. And, inspired by these plans, he runs without looking. Suddenly there was a squelching sound under his boots. He looked and saw a bare swamp all around, and the lights had disappeared. The old man began jumping from hummock to hummock and wandered into a quagmire. He hesitated, got water in his boots. As soon as he pulled the boots out, he sank waist deep. The old man began to rush about in panic, but remembered in time that twitching and rushing about in the swamp was like death. Then he slowly lay down on his stomach and began to pull himself out of the swell. The swamp did not want to let him go, squelched, gurgled, snorted and even rumbled like a sleepy water nymph. But the old man defeated it. He crawled up to a small island where a crooked, dead tree stood and dry grass grew. He lay face down for a long time, overcome by belated fear. Then he sat up and saw that the lights had appeared again, so close and warm in appearance. But the old man only showed a fig in that direction and added a couple of curse words in a frontline manner. He decided to wait until dawn and not to wander around the swamp at night under any circumstances. He reached to take off his boots and looked. There was only one boot left. The swamp had taken its toll. The old man took off his boot, wrung out his foot wraps and hung them on a tree. He lay down on the dry grass and did not exactly doze off, but rather seemed to freeze. The swamp seemed strange to him, very quiet. Not a night bird would cry out. Not a small animal would rustle. Very quiet, like in a well. It began to turn gray. The old man looked. Sure enough, the swamp was unfamiliar, dead. Usually in their swamps there are various plants, grasses, a lot of water birds, animals and reptiles. There are also whole fields of cranberries, where it is drier, lingonberries. And here, nothing but dry long-haired grass and dry trees. And between the hummocks, dead swamp lakes, stinking like I don't know what. And what struck Grandpa to the depths of his soul, here and there the grass was braided into pigtails, as if someone was playing. By the way, Grandpa said that that night lights were creeping up on him from all sides, as if luring him, as if testing his strength. What if he couldn't stand it, and went towards the light? But Grandpa, like a true communist, only extended his invariable fig in that direction and whispered various indecent expressions. When it got light, the old man put on his shoes, broke off a large piece of dry wood and went to clear a swamp. So, from hummock to hummock, sometimes falling through, he swept quite a lot. He looks an inviting island looms on the course, high, dry. He needs to rest and catch his breath. The old man looks, a twig is stuck on the island, and a red rag is tied to it. He is happy, thinking that someone left a note on the right way. Suddenly the old man swows. He feels sick, black rags dance before his eyes, and his head is blown, so he became like a drunk. With the last of his strength, he goes to the island, the red rag before his eyes as a landmark. The old man approaches the pole. He was just about to grab hold of it, when suddenly the red rag barks like a fox and runs across the swamp. And the old man runs in the other direction, runs and curses the devils at the top of his voice. Either the famous Russian mother helped, or God pardoned him, an old sinner and soldier. But the grandfather did not drown in the swamp, but jumped out onto a high place. From there he saw cultivated fields and someone's farm. Already missing to boots, the grandfather hobbled to the farm and thought, "Whose house is this? It seems familiar. I'll go ask kind people to show me the way home. I must have gone very far from home." He comes closer, looks, and this is his home. He entered the house, no one, sat down on the porch and rested. Suddenly, he sees a crowd of people running and his Maria in front, bareheaded. They ran up, stopped, gaping at him, and the grandmother threw herself on the grandfather's chest. "Izotka, Izotka, where have you been? The whole world has been looking for you," everyone screamed. "Didn't you hear your name?" That's how the goblin led my grandfather. After that, my grandfather was very ill from overwork, but he drank mead regularly. With his son-in-law, that is, with my dad. Over the mead, my grandfather would tell this story every time, always embellishing it. My father would say to him, "Dad, aren't you ashamed? You're an old Bolshevik, and you believe in the devil. You just breathed in the swamp, and it's all just a figment of your imagination." My grandfather would get very angry and, beating his chest, would prove that everything that happened to him that night was true, including the devils. He couldn't have gotten lost so easily. He couldn't have failed to recognize the area, and there had never been such a swamp there before. And the shining lights. He would cry out, "A swamp rotten thing," they would answer. And the running red scarf. "So Dad, only in Germany are devils red, and here they are black, as it should be. Pierfew on you, let's have a drink." That's how all the arguments ended. After the feast, Grandpa would go to bed, and Daddy would put on a sheepskin coat, tanned inside out, and go to the village to scare the people. He couldn't stay at his mother-in-law's without jokes. And my grandfather, may he rest his soul, was convinced for the rest of his life that he had entered into a confrontation with evil spirits and emerged victorious.